When we think about a structural collapse, we usually picture a building, right?
Right, yeah.
Like an earthquake hits, the foundation cracks, and the whole thing comes down in this massive, violent cloud of dust. It's huge, it's visible, and it's entirely external.
Exactly. I mean, it is a disaster you can literally see happening from blocks away.
But today on this deep dive, we are looking at a structural collapse that is completely invisible. It happens entirely inside the human body, sometimes in just a matter of minutes, and, it affects millions of people.
Right.
So we've got a stack of medical history, epidemiology reports, and pathophysiology notes on the table today. And our mission is to look at the hidden physics, the microscopic immune battles, and the profound medical misunderstandings behind a single terrifying event: the asthma attack.
And I think to really grasp what is happening during one of these events, we have to start by forgetting almost everything popular culture has taught us.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, because this is not just a simple muscle spasm. And it's definitely not just, heavy breathing or getting winded.
Right, because if you are, like most people listening to this right now, you probably think of an asthma attack as a sudden cough, a wheeze, maybe needing to sit down and use an inhaler.
Yeah, that's the standard image.
But the sources reveal a massive multi-system architectural collapse of the hyperreactive airway. It's so much more complex.
That is the perfect way to frame it, actually. Clinically, the medical term for this event is an acute asthma exacerbation. And the absolute key word in that definition is reversible.
Reversible.
Right.
Yeah.
If you look at disease like, say, emphysema, the structural damage to the lung is permanent. The tissue is physically destroyed. But the airway narrowing in an asthma attack can, at least theoretically, be undone. The airway can go back to normal.
Okay, so it can reset.
Yes.
Yeah.
However, the biological process of getting to that narrowed state is incredibly intense. It's actually 3 distinct overlapping processes happening at the exact same time in your small and medium airways.
3 things all at once.
Exactly. First, you have bronchospasm, which is the physical contraction of the smooth muscle wrapping around the airway. Second, you have acute inflammation, meaning the inner walls of the airway are rapidly swelling up with fluid.
Right.
And third, you have the hypersecretion of thick, sticky mucus, plugging whatever space is left.
Okay, but before we get into the microscopic biology of how those 3 things happen, I was struck by a section in the sources that basically says, ignore the biology for a second. We actually need to start with the cold, hard physics of airflow.
Oh, absolutely.
Because that's really the only way to understand why this biological event feels so catastrophic to the person experiencing it.
We have to talk about a principle of fluid dynamics called Poiseuille's law.
Poiseuille's law.
Right. It's a mathematical law that describes the resistance to flow through a tube. And what Poiseuille's law tells us is that the resistance to air flowing through your airway isn't just inversely proportional to the radius of that airway.
Right.
It is inversely proportional to the 4th power of the radius.
The 4th power, that math is just brutal when you apply it to a human lung.
It really is.
It means that if the radius of your airway gets cut in half, the resistance to the air flowing through it doesn't just double. It's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. It increases 16-fold.
16-fold, yes.
So imagine drinking a thick milkshake through a normal plastic straw. Now imagine that straw suddenly shrinks to half its width. You don't just have to suck twice as hard. You have to suck 16 times harder just to pull the exact same amount of liquid into your mouth. That is the mechanical reality happening inside the lungs in minutes.
And what's fascinating here is that this mathematical reality completely shatters the old misconception that asthma is purely a muscle spasm.
How so?
Well, when you realize that any microscopic reduction in the airway radius creates this massive exponential increase in resistance, you realize that the swelling of the tissue and the lining of mucus are just as guilty for that 16-fold drop in airflow as the contracting muscle is.
Oh, wow. Which also perfectly explains why the smallest airways, the ones way down deep in the lungs, are in the most immediate danger.
Exactly.
Because if you have a large airway, a little bit of swelling might reduce the radius by like 10%. You'll feel it, but you'll survive. But if you have a tiny airway that already has a microscopic radius, just a tiny layer of swelling or a thin coat of mucus cuts that radius in half instantly.
Right. The margins for error in the small airways are practically non-existent. The physics turn against you incredibly fast.
Okay, so Poiseuille's law explains the why the narrowing creates such a severe life-threatening sensation of suffocation. But what is actually triggering the airway to shrink in the first place?
Right, let's get into the biology in action.
Yeah.
The sources describe this as a 2-phased assault. Let's break down the actual immunological sequence.
Okay.
So in allergic asthma, which we clinically call type 2 asthma, this is classically described as a type I hypersensitivity reaction.
Type I.
Yeah, it is the exact same immune category as a severe peanut allergy or a bee sting allergy. And it unfolds in two distinct waves.
Okay, so what's the first wave?
The early phase happens in minutes. Let's say an inhaled trigger like a microscopic piece of pollen or proteins from dust mite feces crosses the protective lining of the airway.
And waiting right beneath that lining are the mast cells.
Yes. Mast cells are specialized immune cells embedded deeply in the airway tissue. And sitting on the surface of these mast cells are thousands of highly specific antibodies called IgE.
You know, in reading the breakdown of this, the best way I could visualize these IgE antibodies is like a highly specific microscopic tripwire.
A tripwire. I like that.
Yeah, like a dust mite tripwire will only detonate if a dust mite protein touches it. It completely ignores everything else like dog dander or pollen. But the second its specific target brushes against it, it triggers the cell.
That is exactly how it works. When the specific trigger binds to those IgE antibodies, it cross-links them. This physical cross-linking sends a massive signal into the mast cell, causing it to degranulate.
It explodes, basically.
Yeah. It essentially detonates, instantly dumping a payload of preformed inflammatory chemicals directly into the surrounding tissue. The most famous one is histamine.
Right. Everyone knows histamine from antihistamines.
Exactly. But it also releases these potent lipid mediators called cysteinoleucotrienes.
And what do those chemicals actually do to the surrounding lung tissue once they're dumped?
Well, within seconds, they bind to receptors on the smooth muscle that wraps around the airway, forcing it to violently contract. That is your bronchospasm.
Okay.
And at the exact same time, these chemicals act on the local blood vessels, making the vessel walls physically separate and become leaky. Blood plasma leaks out into the airway tissue, causing it to rapidly swell with fluid.
So the radius shrinks from the outside via the muscle and from the inside via the swelling. But the sources also mention a totally parallel pathway here that doesn't even require an allergy tripwire to go off.
Yes, that is a crucial nuance, the vagal nerve reflex. You have irritant receptors lining your airways that are connected to the vagus nerve.
Right.
Sometimes an irritant triggers those nerves, which then fire back a signal releasing a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine directly forces the airway's smooth muscle to contract.
Which explains why people who have absolutely no allergies can still suffer a severe asthma attack just by walking outside on a freezing winter day or, by smelling strong bleach.
Precisely.
The cold air or the chemical fume isn't triggering an immune cell, it's triggering a nerve reflex. The body's security system is basically malfunctioning because of a temperature drop.
The nerve itself is overreacting and just slamming the door shut.
Okay, so that is the early phase. The tripwire goes off or the nerve misfires, the muscle spasms, the math of Poiseuille's law turns against you, and you can't breathe.
Right.
But wait, I'm stuck on something here based on what we just discussed.
What's that?
If this is driven by a rapid chemical dump and a fast muscle spasm that happens in a matter of minutes, muscle cramps eventually go away. Once the trigger is cleared out, shouldn't the airway just relax? Why are people getting hospitalized for days if this is just a fast twitch?
That is the pivotal question, and the answer lies in the late phase of the attack.
The late phase.
Right. 4 to 8 hours after that initial mast cell detonation, a second, much darker wave hits the lungs. The chemicals released in the early phase act as a homing beacon, recruiting a very specific type of white blood cell from the bloodstream called an eosinophil.
Eosinophils, okay.
And these eosinophils infiltrate the airway wall in massive numbers.
And they don't just sit there, right?
No, they start releasing toxic granule proteins. They act like microscopic wrecking balls. These proteins are so caustic that they actively destroy and strip away the epithelial lining, the protective inner skin of the airway itself.
Wait, really? So they're literally toxic to your own lungs?
Yes, the immune system is destroying the very organ it is trying to protect. And all of this intense cellular damage and inflammatory soup causes the goblet cells, the specialized cells in the airway lining that manufacture mucus, to go into absolute overdrive.
And this isn't just normal everyday mucus, is it?
Far from it. Normal mucus is relatively thin. It's supposed to sweep debris up and out of the lungs. But in the late phase of an asthma attack, the goblet cells hypersecrete this incredibly thick, dense, gelatinous mucus.
Gross.
Yeah, it is so thick that as the airway muscle spasms and twists, the mucus is literally molded into dense corkscrews that completely plug the small airways. They are called Kirschmann spirals.
Kirschmann spirals.
And patients will sometimes undergo violent coughing fits and literally cough up these spirals, along with crystallized microscopic remnants of the dead eosinophils, which are called Charcot-Leyden crystals.
I mean, that paints a picture of an absolute microscopic war zone. It's not just a muscle twitch. It's structural damage, toxic protein dumping, and physical corkscrews of mucus suffocating the airway.
It is a literal war zone, and this late-phase destruction is exactly why a standard rescue inhaler often completely fails to resolve a severe, prolonged attack.
Oh, because the rescue inhaler only relaxes the muscle.
Exactly. A rescue inhaler is a bronchodilator. Its only job is to relax the smooth muscle. It does absolutely nothing to stop the toxic eosinophil proteins. It doesn't drain the fluid swelling, and it cannot dissolve the mucus corkscrews.
Right.
That is why emergency rooms have to use high-dose corticosteroids. Steroids don't relax muscles. They shut down the white blood cells. They put out the cellular fire so the tissue can finally stop taking damage.
Okay, so this two-part sequence, the rapid muscle spasm followed by this toxic, tissue-destroying inflammatory wave, it makes total logical sense to us now. It explains the physics, it explains the symptoms and the treatments.
Yes.
But one of the most fascinating parts of these sources is realizing that the global medical establishment had this completely backward for over a century. If the late-phase inflammation is doing all the real damage, why did it take so long for medicine to figure that out?
Because for thousands of years, the medical world could only classify diseases by what they could hear and see on the outside.
Ah, right. No microscopes.
Exactly. Going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, asthma was just seen as a symptom. The word asthma actually comes from the Greek word azene, which roughly translates to pant or to breathe hard. Even Hippocrates wrote about it merely as a generic descriptor of breathlessness, not as a specific internal disease.
Right, but eventually we developed a biological theory for it.
We did, but it was flawed. In 1860, a British physician named Henry Hyde Salter, who actually suffered from severe asthma himself, was the first to systematically argue that asthma was a physical disease of the bronchial muscle.
Okay.
He published a highly influential book arguing that the breathlessness was caused by a spasmodic stricture of the airway muscles.
So he basically said this is a muscle cramp in the lungs.
Yes, and that spasm model completely dominated medical thinking for the next 100 years. By 1892, William Osler, who is considered one of the founding fathers of modern medicine, published a definitive textbook where he described asthma essentially as a neurosis of the bronchial muscles.
So the prevailing wisdom from the top medical minds in the world was, this is a purely spastic disease. You have twitchy muscles, and if we can just figure out how to force those muscles to relax, we cure the disease.
Exactly. The inflammation was completely ignored because they couldn't see it until 1989.
Yes, the 1989 biopsy revolution. The sources highlight this as the moment the entire paradigm shatters.
It truly was a revolution. A team of researchers, led by Richard Beasley and Stephen Holgate, decided to do something unprecedented.
What did they do?
Up until that point, doctors didn't look at the lung tissue of asthmatics unless the patient had died of a severe attack. But Beasley and Holgate decided to perform fiber optic bronchial biopsies on living, mild, asymptomatic asthma patients.
Meaning they took physical tissue samples from the lungs of people who felt totally fine on that given day, people who weren't coughing, weren't wheezing, and weren't having an attack.
Right, and what they saw under the microscope forced a complete frantic rewrite of the medical textbooks. Even in these patients who felt perfectly fine, the biopsies revealed dense infiltrations of those toxic eosinophils. They saw active structural damage and the shedding of the epithelial lining.
So what does this all mean for the patient? It means the disease doesn't just pack up and go away when you stop coughing?
Precisely. It proved that the inflammatory disease is present continuously. It is a chronic, smoldering fire. The acute attack, the coughing and wheezing, is just a visible flare-up of that baseline invisible fire.
Right.
Because of those biopsies, the official definition fundamentally changed. Asthma stopped being thought of as just spastic airways and officially became chronically inflamed airways that are prone to spasming.
But reading through the epidemiology reports, it becomes horrifyingly clear that this wasn't just an academic debate over textbook definitions. Treating asthma like a simple muscle spasm instead of a chronic inflammatory disease actually led to mass casualties.
It did. It is a very dark chapter in medical history, specifically what is now known as the Phenotyrol Affair in New Zealand.
The Phenotyrol Affair.
Yes. Between the late 1970s and the late 1980s, New Zealand experienced two distinct, terrifying epidemics of asthma mortality. Young, otherwise healthy people were suddenly dying of asthma at unprecedented rates.
That's awful.
Epidemiologists launched massive investigations and eventually traced the excess deaths to a specific drug called phenobarbital.
And phenobarbital was a high-dose inhaled beta agonist. It was a rescue medication, right?
Yes, it was an incredibly potent, fast-acting bronchodilator. It was essentially a superpowered muscle relaxer for the lungs.
Because it only treated the muscle, it didn't do anything for the inflammation.
Exactly. And that was the fatal flaw. Patients were taking puff after puff of this powerful drug. It relaxed the muscle so effectively that the patients felt falsely reassured.
Oh, no.
Their airways were temporarily held open by chemical force, so they went about their day thinking they were fine. But beneath that artificially relaxed muscle, the late-phase inflammation, the toxic eosinophils, the swelling, the mucus production, was silently raging out of control.
The rescue medication was a siren song. It basically tricked patients and doctors into ignoring the actual fire burning in their lungs until the structural swelling and mucus plugging became so severe that relaxing the muscle no longer mattered. The airway collapsed entirely.
It masked the underlying disease until it was fatal. Once the medical guidelines were drastically changed to ensure that anti-inflammatory treatments, like inhaled steroids, were the foundation of asthma care, the death rates in New Zealand plummeted.
I mean, it is a chilling reminder of how dangerous it is to treat a symptom without understanding the mechanism. But if rescue inhalers were just masking the underlying fire, what was actually lighting the match on a macro level? Because what I didn't realize until reading these environmental reports is that the trigger isn't always an individual person encountering their own personal allergy, like a cat. Sometimes the trigger is the entire environment attacking a city all at once.
Yes, once you understand asthma as an inflammatory vulnerability to the environment, you start seeing these massive, synchronized population-level events. A classic example is the Barcelona soybean dust epidemics.
Right.
Between 1981 and 1987, emergency rooms across Barcelona would suddenly be flooded with hundreds of severe asthma patients, all at the exact same time. Multiple people died.
And they eventually traced it to the city's harbor.
Right. Ships were unloading massive silos of soybeans without adequate filtration systems. The soybean dust was aerosolizing, drifting over the city, and simultaneously detonating those microscopic IgE tripwires in the airways of thousands of susceptible people at the exact same moment.
Wow.
It proved that asthma attacks can be genuine, synchronized environmental disasters.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because if soybean dust drifting from a harbor makes sense as an airborne irritant, I saw something in the notes about Melbourne, Australia in 2016, thunderstorm asthma. That sounds completely counterintuitive to me. Doesn't a massive rainstorm wash pollen out of the air and make allergy sufferers feel better?
You would absolutely think so. Rain usually clears the air. But on November 21st, 2016, a severe freak thunderstorm hit Melbourne right during the absolute peak of the ryegrass pollen season.
Okay.
The intense updrafts of the storm swept tons of whole pollen grains high into the clouds. Up there, the sudden changes in humidity and moisture caused those pollen grains to undergo a physical process called osmotic shock.
Meaning water rushed into the pollen grain until the pressure was too high.
Yes. The pollen grains literally burst open. They ruptured into thousands of microscopic subpollen fragments. Now, normally, a whole grain of pollen is relatively large. If you breathe it in, it gets trapped by the hairs and mucus in your nose. It never reaches your lungs.
But these ruptured fragments were different.
They were so incredibly small that they bypassed the body's natural nasal filtration system entirely. The storm downdrafts pushed these microscopic fragments back down to street level, and everyone who was outside breathed them deeply into their lower airways.
That is wild.
Within just a few hours, emergency services in Melbourne were completely overwhelmed by thousands of patients in acute respiratory distress. Several people died, including individuals who had never even been diagnosed with asthma before.
A meteorological event literally weaponized a standard allergy season, bypassing human anatomy to cause a mass casualty event. That is staggering.
It is.
And it leads me to wonder, based on the public health section of our sources, is asthma purely an allergy issue, or is the environment shaping this in other ways?
The environment is shaping it in profound ways, and modern medicine has realized it is not just one single disease.
Sure.
We talked a lot about type 2 allergic asthma driven by eosinophils. But there is a huge portion of patients with non-type 2 asthma.
And what's that driven by?
Their inflammation is driven by a completely different white blood cell called the neutrophil.
Okay, so what triggers a neutrophil response?
It is much less about pollen and much more commonly linked to adult onset factors. Things like obesity, heavy exposure to cigarette smoke, or occupational irritants like industrial chemicals, the patient looks exactly the same in the emergency room. They are wheezing and struggling to breathe, and Poiseuille's law is suffocating them. But the underlying cellular machinery lighting the fire is fundamentally different. We now call these different pathways endotypes.
Endotypes, okay. But even with these different pathways, there is the undeniable statistical reality that asthma prevalence simply skyrocketed across industrialized countries in the late 20th century. Why are modern industrialized populations suddenly so hyperreactive?
One of the most compelling explanations is David Strachan's 1989 hygiene hypothesis.
The hygiene hypothesis.
Right. Strachan looked at epidemiological data and noticed that children who had more older siblings, meaning they were exposed to more germs, more colds, and more dirt in early childhood, actually had significantly lower rates of allergies and asthma.
So how does getting sick as a kid protect you from asthma?
The theory is that the human immune system evolved over millions of years, expecting to fight off constant parasitic worms and serious bacterial threats. But in our ultra-clean, sterilized, modern early lives, those threats are gone.
So the immune system is bored.
Exactly. Our developing immune systems are essentially like a bored army with no enemies to fight. So, lacking proper early life training from those old microbial friends, the immune system skews toward type 2 responses, aggressively attacking completely harmless things like dust mites or pollen.
The immune system is basically hallucinating threats because it was never trained properly.
That's a great way to put it.
But reading the public health reports, it is clear it isn't just about homes being too clean. The social determinants of who suffers from this disease are glaring.
They are deeply intertwined with socioeconomic disparities. The reports highlight how a warming climate is leading to longer, more intense pollen seasons globally. But locally, we see severe urban air pollution disproportionately concentrated in lower-income neighborhoods near highways and industrial sites.
And the housing conditions themselves act as a trigger, right?
Exactly. Substandard housing, where things like cockroach frass, mold, and mouse dander are prevalent, provides a constant daily bombardment of microscopic triggers.
Right.
When you combine that constant environmental assault with a lack of access to crucial preventative anti-inflammatory medications, you get incredibly stark racial and economic disparities in asthma mortality.
Yeah.
You cannot separate the biology of why a specific airway narrows from the social conditions of who is forced to breathe in those triggers every single day.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring up one specific clinical detail from the sources that completely blew my mind because it shatters a major myth.
Oh, what's that?
I always assumed that if you saw someone having an asthma attack, the louder and more violent the wheezing sound was, the closer they were to danger. Like, loud noise equals bad attack.
It is a very common assumption, and it is a terrifyingly dangerous misconception.
Great. Really?
Yeah. Think about the physics of sound. To produce a wheeze, you need air squeezing forcefully through a narrow tube. Sound requires airflow.
Oh, God. I see where this is going.
If a patient is having a severe attack and that loud wheezing suddenly stops, but their chest is still heaving and they're still visibly struggling to breathe, that is not a sign of improvement.
The silent chest.
The silent chest. It means the inflammation and the mucus plugging have become so utterly complete that the airflow has dropped too low to even generate a sound. The airway is essentially sealed. A silent chest during an attack is an absolute critical medical emergency.
A silent chest is worse than a loud wheeze. That is a horrifying but incredibly vital piece of knowledge to walk away with.
Absolutely.
So let's synthesize the journey we've been on today for you all. We started with the sheer panic of Poiseuille's law, that unforgiving mathematical reality where having an airway radius increases the resistance to breathing by 16-fold.
Right.
We walked through the microscopic war zone of the two-phase immune assault, where tripwire IgE antibodies and toxic eosinophils wreak havoc on the tissue. We saw how the 1989 biopsy revolution finally forced the medical world to realize that the muscle spasm is just a symptom of a chronic, smoldering inflammatory fire.
A lesson medicine learned the hard way through the tragic Phenoterol affair, unfortunately.
Yeah. And we've explored how our modern changing environment, from osmotic shock and thunderstorms to urban inequality, is actively shaping the very air we breathe.
It really is a profound shift in how we understand human biology. But the sources we reviewed hint at an even deeper frontier that we are just beginning to grapple with. It's a concept called airway remodeling.
Airway remodeling.
Yes. We talked at the beginning about how asthma is defined as being reversible. But when a patient suffers through decades of this repeated chronic inflammation and these constant microscopic cellular wars, the airways physically scar.
Oh, whoa.
The basement membrane of the lung thickens. The smooth muscle permanently hypertrophies or bulks up. The patient develops fixed, permanent obstructions, and the line between asthma and a permanent disease like COPD begins to blur.
So the reversible structural collapse eventually becomes a permanent architectural ruin?
Exactly. And it leaves us with a fascinating, provocative thought for the future of medicine. If decades of invisible chronic inflammation can physically scar and permanently remodel the microscopic architecture of our lungs, could the future of respiratory medicine shift entirely? What if the next revolution isn't just about inventing better inhalers to suppress inflammation? What if the next era of medicine figures out how to literally reverse engineer the scarring and physically rebuild the microscopic structure of a damaged lung?
Uncollapsing the architecture, rebuilding the hyperreactive airway from the ground up. That is an incredible thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking past the surface of things, and we will see you next time.